So, for those who don't know, I recently just made and released a brand new video game by the name of The Quarantine. Is it my most impressive project so far? Personally, I'd say so myself. Um, but honestly, if we're really serious and honest here, it's not necessarily the best. I definitely already know that there's a lot of issues with it, but you know what? Today we're going to go over exactly just that. Today we're just going to be talking about some behind the scenes, some things to know about the game, and that's all. Just some general developer commentary, I guess you could say. First, we got to talk about how this idea came to fruition. What caused this idea to be made? So, when I was thinking about making this game, I was mainly thinking about two very important themes that I had to implement, and that was the theme of isolation and the theme of quarantine. Personally, I tried to make sure to keep the concept and idea as simple as possible, mainly because the one thing that can be the end of a game developer is, of course, going too ambitious too quick. So, as soon as you're done, like, programming the basic movement for a character, all of a sudden you want to start, creating the next, I don't know, FIFA, you know? Obviously, the realistic truth is that you gotta go small by like small steps, baby steps, one at a time. Um, so yeah, I just tried to keep the idea as simple as I could, but generally speaking, the final concept was basically this sort of program where you'd see this guy, like an archive of this guy's recordings, as he slowly descends into madness and as something or someone is supposedly, watching over him or like stalking him or something like that. Um, but yeah, some things about the game that I have to mention. Some things about the game that I have to talk about, of course, obviously, are the assets. Um, as embarrassing or as not embarrassing as it is, I had to go full asset flipper mode and like have 90% of the assets that you see in the game um, literally just be ripped straight off online. On screen, I'll probably show you what the assets are, and if you so you can like fellow game developers can use them themselves. But the truth is that I didn't want to have to go through the real struggle of having to model a bunch of things. And also, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I actually had given myself a deadline. I was originally going to say the deadline was going to be like 3 weeks, but realistically, I just said, you know what, just finish it before graduation, which was going to be very soon. And as of recording, actually already passed, so yip yip hooray, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, um, yeah. So generally speaking, the game was like I don't know how to say it. It was like the game. Um, it kind of was hard to make, but at the same time wasn't. First, we have to talk about the character. At first, I was gonna use the new input system for the Unity game engine. For those who don't know, the new input system is basically kind of like a complex version of well, not a complex. Okay, let me explain. So the new input system, right, is basically supposed to be an improved version of the old input system. The old input system, you could program it very easily if you're using just a keyboard or mouse. But one of the main criticisms of the old input system was that when you used it, when you're trying to, program it on a controller or anything other than a keyboard and mouse, it became a literal nightmare, a programmer's worst nightmare to have to program with the old input system on anything but a keyboard and mouse. So, Unity Technologies, the company behind, of course, the Unity engine, no big surprise there, they came up with the new input system, which simplified the process in exchange for it having a very steep learning curve. So it's very hard to learn, but once you learn it, you're basically good. You're basically Gucci. but after but yeah, every time I've tried to work with it, I've always found myself getting into some kind of trouble or some kind of struggle with it. But that's just how it is. And at first, I was able to get a first person character working on there, but when I started talking about interactions, when I started getting into, actually having the game have some kind of interaction, that's when it started to kind of fall apart, and I ended up having to revert back to the old input system because truth is, I don't think anybody's going to be playing my game with an Xbox controller. Let's just be real here. Um, but yeah, and honestly, other than that, the one of the most difficult ones. Okay, this is gonna sound really stupid and really silly, but the most difficult part wasn't even actually like programming the game or having the sequences. No, it was programming the doors. Okay, so in the game, if editor me could show footage of it, uh, there's these prompts that would show up that would say, okay, like press E to open and close door, and it's kind of like the only interactable part about it. But we'll get into that later. Um, and what I thought was so funny was how stupidly difficult it was to actually implement the feature. I mean, it wasn't like stupidly difficult in the sense that it was harder than working with the new input system. Obviously, it was going to be way more harder. Uh, but the door was just like it was annoying. That's what made it difficult for me. It was annoying to implement because I would be following a tutorial, right? Because of course, obviously, I follow a tutorial to make the game, trying to get it done as quick as possible. Obviously, I'm gonna be falling into the hands of tutorials, but I was trying to work on the tutorial, trying to follow it step by step. Next thing you know, after following it step by step, one of the things that it was supposed to do was that when you pressed on it, when you pressed E, um, it would open, and then on command it would close. But instead, it just opened and closed. And because of how the animation worked, it would just like open and close for like a split second, and you'd have to basically be the Flash if you wanted to, slide yourself through. So after like many, what felt like hours of trying to troubleshoot it, trying to fix the issue, I just said, you know what, screw it, and just modified the animation so then that way the door could close just a little bit slower and therefore still work. I mean, obviously it's not the best solution, but listen, I'm trying to get the game done as soon as possible, and I could care less about a freaking animation for a door. But yeah, that's basically what the entire development sequence was. The rest of it was just sort of modifying the map, adding furniture, you know, maybe adding a few textures of my own. I mean, yeah, I went through some issues, but most of them were pretty easy to jump over and pretty easy to work around. And yeah, that was basically the entire dev sequence and also how this idea came to fruition, That's just kind of how it was. It sort of just built itself, in my opinion, if you ask me, because the pieces were already there. I just needed to, put it together into one big puzzle piece. Okay, and so some very exclusive things to know about this game was that number one, it was actually going to be way more. I don't know how to say this. It was going to be way more bigger than what I initially came up with. Because when I was thinking of it, I was thinking of it being way more longer and way more bigger. But obviously, like, it's the actual gameplay itself, when you record it from start to finish, is like, what, 10 minutes less than? Um, and obviously, that kind of design was probably just the result of me rushing it a little bit and obviously not getting as much content in. But, one of the things that I was thinking of implementing was having the game be in black and white. So, kind of like, how do I explain it? So it was kind of like supposed to be sort of in the Game Boy way, where instead of it being, green and black, it was black and white. So it would look more like an old film than it did, you know, uh, something, straight out of an old VHS tape. So ultimately, I still ended up keeping the pixelated look, but I ditched the black and white aesthetic, the black and white look. Um, but yeah, later on, things started to, of course, do this and do that. One scene that I didn't implement into the game was obviously the test scene, and the footage that I'm showing you right now is actually that exact test scene that I never put into the game for obvious reasons. Obviously, this was not going to be the actual game. Neither will it be in the actual game. But I think it's a pretty interesting thing to look at, especially when you look at it from how it is. Uh, I mean, like, to think, as you can see, obviously, it's way more darker than the original game. It's also way more. How do I say this? It's way more like blacked out. It's like it looks more like a fever dream, if you ask me, like a fever dream that you'd have. Uh, but yeah, that was basically it for any of the exclusive look into it. I also tried to model the attic door that you see in the game. For some reason, that didn't work out, so I just ultimately threw together a bunch of cubes and said, "Yeah, that's an attic door, guys. That's a real nice attic door." But yeah. And now, without further ado, it's time we finally step into the meaty part, the criticism. Oh boy. So I actually ended up showing it to some of my friends. Um, and one of the first immediate criticisms, which I actually agree with 100%, was the lack of interaction in the game. Um, Obviously, like I said, I tried to get it done as soon as I could. By the time I released it, it was already like a few days before graduation, and that was my ultimate goal anyway. So I was like, screw it, just release it. But yeah, I can definitely agree with the fact that there was like almost zero interactability there. Because the closest thing you had to an interaction was opening and closing a door. Maybe in future games, depending on what they may be, I might add some more interaction. I mean, I am working on another game. Uh, that would be a different video in itself, though. Uh, but yeah, I can definitely agree with the criticism that, of course, obviously there wasn't a lot of interaction. Uh, and I don't know about you, but I feel like the game isn't that scary. I mean, throughout the whole game, you don't necessarily see the entity that's supposedly watching over you, that's supposedly chasing you down. And generally speaking, I just feel like the lack of content kind of prevented it from being as scary as it probably should have been. But generally speaking, I mean, like generally, like I'll keep on saying this a lot. Generally speaking, this was just a game that I made for fun, you know. And obviously, while some criticisms and final remarks about the game uh, would obviously make some sense, it was all just for fun, something to do before the school year ended, and I would live the rest of my summer uh, alone, just sitting in my room, making random YouTube videos because I'm bored and I'm lonely and a little bit lazy. Okay, anyway, but yeah. So, generally speaking, that's kind of it. This video seems to be a lot more longer than I initially anticipated it to be. Apologize for that. But yeah, generally speaking, I guess you guys can have a good day. I'll see you guys later. Peace.
I'm a good son for you. I think my nose.